On a cold April night in 1865, as the streets of Washington trembled with celebration and uncertainty, a sealed leather satchel vanished from a burning railway car just outside Baltimore, and with it disappeared a secret that would sleep beneath American history for more than a century. The satchel belonged to a young War Department courier named Thomas Alder, a former printer's apprentice from Philadelphia who had joined the Union Army not with a rifle, but with ink-stained fingers and a talent for remembering everything he read. Thomas had an unusual gift. He could memorize entire pages after a single careful glance. His superiors used him as a living cipher machine, entrusting him with dispatches too sensitive to commit fully to paper. He would carry fragments in his head and fragments in code, each useless without the other. In the spring of 1865, the Civil War was staggering toward its end. Richmond had fallen. Confederate forces were collapsing. President Abraham Lincoln spoke openly of reconciliation. But within the War Department, whispers of something darker were spreading. Rumors of a clandestine Confederate network determined to prolong chaos even after formal surrender. They called themselves the Phoenix Circle. Thomas first heard the name in a cramped office lit by sputtering gas lamps. His commanding officer, Colonel Edwin Harrow, slid a thin folio across the desk. "You will memorize the names on these pages," Harrow said quietly. "You will then burn them." Thomas obeyed without question. The list contained prominent businessmen from New York, ship captains in Charleston, bankers in London, and at least 3 members of Congress, all allegedly tied to a covert fund intended to finance sabotage, assassinations, and foreign alliances should the Confederacy fall. The Phoenix Circle believed defeat in battle did not mean defeat in destiny. Their plan was audacious: destabilize Reconstruction, manipulate financial markets, and fracture the fragile unity of the restored nation until Southern interests could reassert dominance through economic warfare rather than cannons. On April 14th, the night Lincoln was shot, Thomas was aboard a northbound train carrying coded correspondence confirming that several members of the Phoenix Circle had already infiltrated northern institutions. When news of the assassination spread like wildfire through the cars, panic erupted. Some passengers wept, others shouted accusations. In the chaos, just as the train slowed near a switching yard outside Baltimore, a sudden explosion tore through the baggage compartment. Later reports would call it an accident, an overheated boiler, but Thomas, choking on smoke and splintered wood, saw something that never appeared in official records: a man in a gray waistcoat calmly lifting the leather satchel from the flames before vanishing into the darkness. Thomas survived. The satchel did not. In the weeks that followed, the nation plunged into mourning. Reconstruction began amid bitterness and suspicion. Thomas reported the theft to Colonel Harrow, but without the physical cipher key that had been inside the satchel, the memorized fragments in his mind were nearly useless. Harrow ordered silence. If the public learns that a secret network survived the war intact, the country could fracture again before it has time to heal. Thomas returned to civilian life, carrying a burden he could not share. He married, opened a modest print shop in Harrisburg, and tried to forget the list of names etched permanently into his memory. But the years that followed convinced him the Phoenix Circle had not vanished. Railroad monopolies expanded with suspicious speed. Southern industrialists who claimed ruin emerged mysteriously funded. Violent resistance to Reconstruction intensified, often with resources that seemed too organized to be spontaneous. Financial panics rocked the nation, including the crisis of 1873, which wiped out thousands of small investors while leaving certain banking houses strangely insulated. Thomas began quietly investigating.
Under the guise of business trips for printing contracts, he traveled to New York, Chicago, and Atlanta. He watched patterns form, investments traced back to shell companies, shipping manifests linked to British financiers sympathetic to the Southern cause. He recognized 3 names from the burned folio now attached to powerful corporations shaping the new American economy. By 1881, Thomas was no longer a naive courier. He was a methodical collector of evidence. In a hidden room behind his print shop, he recreated the cipher from memory, piecing together fragments he had never written down. He began corresponding anonymously with a small circle of reform-minded journalists. One of them, a young reporter named Clara Whitfield, possessed both courage and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. Clara had grown up in Ohio, daughter of a Union veteran who lost a leg at Antietam. She believed fiercely in the promise of an America rebuilt on equality. When Thomas first contacted her with hints of a post-war conspiracy manipulating national reconstruction, she was skeptical, but the documents he eventually showed her, ledger copies, coded telegram transcripts, investment records, were too consistent to dismiss. Together they uncovered a web stretching from Southern cotton syndicates to Northern steel magnates. The Phoenix Circle had evolved. It was no longer a romantic band of diehards clinging to a lost cause. It had become something colder, a trans-regional alliance of elites who believed democracy was inefficient and that economic leverage could shape the nation more effectively than ballots. Strategy was subtle. Fund extremist groups to inflame racial tensions, support politicians who advocated states' rights rhetoric while quietly advancing corporate consolidation, trigger financial squeezes to eliminate small competitors. Over decades, the effect was cumulative. Wealth concentrated, political polarization deepened, Reconstruction's promises eroded. In 1890, Clara prepared to publish an explosive exposé. Days before it went to press, her boarding house caught fire under suspicious circumstances. She escaped with her life, but her notes were destroyed. The newspaper's editor, facing pressure from investors, abruptly withdrew support. Clara received anonymous threats warning her to abandon phantoms of the past. Thomas realized they were being watched. Undeterred, he made a radical decision. He would not merely expose the Phoenix Circle, he would infiltrate it. Through a contact in New York's financial district, an accountant drowning in gambling debt, Thomas learned of a private investment consortium meeting discreetly under different names, but linked by familiar faces. Using forged credentials and his lifelong skill with documents, Thomas secured a position as a record keeper for one of their subsidiary companies. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Minutes from closed-door meetings revealed coordinated efforts to influence senatorial appointments, funds allocated to paramilitary groups enforcing voter suppression in the South, strategic investments timed to coincide with legislative votes affecting tariffs and banking regulations. The Circle believed they were guardians of stability. In their view, rapid social equality threatened economic order. By steering policy from behind the curtain, they claimed to preserve prosperity. But their preservation required manipulation, secrecy, and the quiet sacrifice of democratic ideals. Thomas copied everything. For 2 years he fed information to Clara, who had relocated to Chicago under a false name. They built a case too extensive to suppress easily. In 1893, as another devastating financial panic swept the country, they saw opportunity. Public anger toward financiers was at its peak. Trust in institutions wavered. Clara coordinated with multiple newspapers simultaneously, ensuring that no single publisher could be pressured into silence. On October 3, 1893, a series of front-page articles appeared across several major cities detailing the existence of a long-running post-war network manipulating Reconstruction and economic policy for nearly 30 decades. The reaction was explosive. Congress launched investigations. Hearings summoned powerful industrialists who denied everything. Some records mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses recanted under oath, yet enough evidence survived to shatter the illusion of intouchability. Several key figures resigned. A handful faced prosecution for financial crimes, unrelated on the surface to the circle, but connected in quiet footnotes. The Phoenix Circle did not collapse entirely. Power rarely evaporates, it adapts, but its cohesion fractured. Internal distrust grew as members suspected one another of leaking information. Their ability to coordinate nationally weakened. Thomas, aging and exhausted, retreated from public life once more. Clara continued her journalism, becoming a respected voice for transparency and reform. Progressive-era policies
that emerged in the early 20th century, antitrust laws, banking regulations, investigative reporting standards, owed something, though few realized it, to the shadow war Thomas and Clara had fought. On his deathbed in 1912, Thomas revealed one final secret to Clara. The original cipher key from the stolen satchel had not been entirely lost. In the smoke and chaos of that Baltimore explosion, he had instinctively torn a small strip from the inner lining before the mysterious man seized it. Sewn into his coat for decades, the fragment contained a sequence of numbers corresponding to foreign accounts established during the war. Clara used it to trace dormant funds still circulating through international banks. The trail extended into the modern era, hinting that the ideology of the Phoenix Circle, elite stewardship over democratic uncertainty, had never truly vanished. The leather satchel was never recovered. The man in the gray waistcoat was never identified, yet the attempt to steer America's destiny from the shadows left fingerprints across decades. And if you look closely at the turning points of history, at moments when public outrage sparks reform, when investigative courage challenges entrenched wealth, you can almost see the echo of a young courier stepping off a burning train, clutching fragments of a secret that powerful men believed would remain buried forever. The fragment Thomas had hidden in his coat was no larger than a postage stamp, brittle with age and browned by decades of body heat. Yet the numbers written across it, columns of 5-digit sequences, were precise, deliberate, and unmistakably part of the original cipher system devised during the war. When Thomas pressed it into Clara Whitfield's hand in the winter of 1912, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "They thought they burned the key," he said, "but they never understood printers." Clara leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "Every code has a rhythm," he replied. "Those numbers don't stand alone. They map to a typesetter's grid, based on page layout, not alphabet alone. I memorized the grid." He died 2 days later, leaving Clara with grief, a scrap of cloth, and the uneasy realization that the Phoenix Circle's financial arteries might still be pulsing through the American economy. The modern age awakens. By 1913, America stood on the brink of transformation. Industrial might had reshaped its cities. Immigrants crowded ports and factories. Reformers were pushing back against monopolies and corruption. The creation of the Federal Reserve System promised greater financial stability after decades of destructive panics. Clara, now in her late 50s, traveled to New York under the pretense of researching a piece on international banking. In truth, she was chasing Thomas's final clue. Using the fragment and her knowledge of his reconstructed cipher, she decoded several account references tied to British and Swiss banks. The dates embedded in the numeric columns corresponded to transactions made during the final months of the Civil War. Transfers of Confederate gold converted quietly into foreign bonds.
But what startled her most was not the origin of the funds, it was their persistence.
Records suggested that portions of the accounts had been reactivated in 1907, the year of another financial panic that shook Wall Street and nearly toppled major banks. The timing was suspicious. Clara had reported extensively on that crisis, which ultimately strengthened arguments for centralized banking reform. Was it coincidence, or had remnants of the Phoenix Circle attempted once again to exploit instability? She knew better than to jump to conclusions. The danger of conspiracy lay in overreach. Thomas had taught her that patterns must be proven, not imagined. Clara reached out to an old contact within the Treasury Department, a meticulous analyst named Robert Hale. Hale owed his career to reform movements sparked by investigative journalism decades earlier. He respected Clara deeply. In a discreet meeting overlooking the Hudson River, she presented the decoded sequences. Hale adjusted his spectacles and frowned. These account numbers, if authentic, would require cross-border authorization to trace. "Can you do it?" Clara asked. He hesitated. Officially, no. Unofficially, perhaps. Over the next months, Hale uncovered a series of financial maneuvers that pointed toward coordinated investment in strategic industries, railroads, steel production, and munitions manufacturing. Not illegal on their own, but the capital origins were opaque, routed through layers of shell corporations, strikingly similar to those Thomas had documented decades earlier. The Phoenix Circle had not re-emerged as a single cohesive body. Instead, it appeared to have evolved into a philosophy adopted by powerful financiers: influence through leverage, control through consolidation. Clara began writing again, not about a secret society, but about systemic opacity. Her articles emphasized transparency in banking, ethical oversight, and the need for public accountability. She avoided dramatic accusations. She focused on structural reform. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially remained neutral, but American industry supplied materials to Allied powers. Profits soared. International finance intertwined with global conflict. Clara watched with wary eyes. War created opportunity for those who thrived on instability. The war that changed everything. By 1917, the United States entered the Great War. Factories ran around the clock. Government contracts flooded corporations with unprecedented wealth. Bonds were sold to citizens in patriotic campaigns. Clara, now elderly but sharp-minded, observed patterns eerily familiar to the post-Civil War era. Concentrated gains among industrial magnates, opaque negotiations behind closed doors, and political rhetoric framed as necessity rather than choice. She never uncovered direct evidence linking the wartime financial surge to the Phoenix legacy, yet the structural resemblance haunted her. In 1919, as the war ended and America faced economic readjustment, Clara's health declined. Before her death in 1921, she archived every document Thomas and she had collected, carefully sealed and stored in a university library under restricted access, labeled simply as Private Reconstruction Papers. She left a note addressed to future historians. Power adapts. It rarely disappears. Study not only events, but the incentives beneath them.
The Roaring Twenties and a Hidden Echo. The 1920s brought exuberance, jazz, automobiles, stock speculation, radio broadcasts. America felt unstoppable. Markets climbed relentlessly. Easy credit fueled dreams of limitless prosperity. Among the rising generation was Daniel Whitfield, Clara's grandson. He had grown up hearing fragments of his grandmother's stories, never the full tale, but enough to understand that history contains shadows. Daniel became an accountant on Wall Street.
Unlike many colleagues intoxicated by speculation, he maintained a cautious approach to numbers. In 1928, reviewing investment trusts for a client, he stumbled upon a familiar structural pattern: multi-layered holding companies designed to obscure ultimate ownership. The names were new, the tactics were not. Daniel requested access to his grandmother's archived papers. After navigating bureaucratic hurdles, he found himself in a quiet reading room, turning brittle pages filled with Thomas Alder's meticulous handwriting. He recognized the method immediately: the use of nested corporations to concentrate control while appearing decentralized. The market crash of 1929 arrived with shocking speed. Fortunes evaporated, banks collapsed, unemployment surged. Daniel survived financially, but witnessed friends lose everything. As congressional investigations into the crash unfolded, Daniel provided anonymous testimony detailing how opaque investment structures amplified systemic risk. His insights contributed quietly to debates that would eventually produce regulatory reforms in the 1930s. He never claimed a hidden conspiracy caused the Great Depression. The crisis was multifaceted: speculation, credit expansion, global imbalances. But Daniel believed that unchecked consolidation and secrecy, principles long associated with the Phoenix ideology, had intensified the collapse. The New Deal and resistance. Franklin Roosevelt's presidency ushered in sweeping reforms: banking regulations, social safety nets, public works programs. Many Americans embraced the changes as necessary stabilization. Yet powerful opposition emerged from segments of the business community who viewed federal expansion as overreach. Daniel observed something intriguing. Several prominent critics of the New Deal reforms were linked through complex financial genealogies to institutions Clara and Thomas had once investigated. The Phoenix Circle as a named entity had faded into myth, but its philosophical airs persisted. Elites convinced that concentrated control was preferable to democratic unpredictability. The 1930s were marked by ideological tension. Across the Atlantic, authoritarian regimes arose, advocating centralized power as antidote to chaos. In America, debates raged over capitalism, regulation, and individual liberty. Daniel married, had children, and eventually left Wall Street for a quieter life in upstate New York. But he preserved Clara's papers and added his own annotations, believing future generations might need them.
World War II and a new global order. The Second World War transformed the United States into a global superpower. Industrial mobilization dwarfed even that of World War I. Government contracts created enormous partnerships between state and corporation. Daniel's son, Michael Whitfield, served as an intelligence analyst during the war. His work involved tracking financial networks supporting Axis operations. In doing so, he developed expertise in tracing hidden capital flows, skills eerily aligned with his family's legacy. After the war, as the Cold War emerged, intelligence agencies expanded their reach. Covert operations became instruments of geopolitical strategy. Financial leverage was deployed alongside military alliances. Michael noticed that the philosophy Thomas had once described, shaping events from behind curtains, had become normalized in international relations. Not always sinister, often justified as necessary containment. Yet the ethical ambiguity persisted. He began quietly researching the historical roots of private influence on public policy. Accessing his grandmother's archives, he realized that the Phoenix Circle represented not merely a post-war Southern plot, but an early manifestation of a broader pattern: concentrated interests seeking to steer national direction without democratic transparency. The 1960s, a nation in turmoil. The 1960s brought civil rights struggles, assassinations, protests, and cultural upheaval. Trust in institutions wavered again. Michael's daughter, Sarah Whitfield, became a journalist, echoing Clara's path. Covering civil rights marches in the South, she witnessed firsthand the enduring legacy of Reconstruction's failures. Voter suppression tactics, economic disparities, and racial tension bore the imprint of unresolved post-Civil War compromises. Sarah discovered that certain political action committees opposing civil rights legislation were funded by foundations with long, tangled financial histories. Tracing ownership through decades, she found indirect connections to corporations once flagged in Thomas's records. But she was careful. History is rarely linear. Institutions evolve. People change. Her reporting focused not on secret cabals, but on transparency in political financing. Her articles contributed to growing public awareness of money's influence in elections. Reforms followed, though imperfectly. The digital age and the return of patterns. By the late 20th century, communication reshaped, financial markets globalized, capital moved at the speed of light across digital networks. Sarah's son, Ethan Whitfield, grew up with computers instead of printing presses. Fascinated by cybersecurity and data analysis, he pursued a career in digital forensics. In the early 2000s, investigating offshore tax shelters for a nonprofit watchdog organization, Ethan encountered shell company architectures strikingly similar to those diagrammed by Thomas Alder in the 19th century. Layers of anonymity, jurisdictions chosen for secrecy, strategic influence exerted through economic leverage. The names were different, the scale was global, but the logic was timeless. Ethan digitized Clara's and Daniel's archives, creating searchable databases linking historical financial patterns to modern equivalents. He did not claim a continuous organization stretching unbroken from 1865. Instead, he proposed a thesis that certain strategies of elite influence recur across generations because incentives remain constant. He published a groundbreaking study titled Shadow Leverage: Historical Continuities in American Financial Influence. The work gained attention in academic circles and among investigative journalists. A century after the burning train. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, Ethan stood near a historic marker outside Baltimore, the approximate site of the railway explosion that had changed his family's destiny. He imagined Thomas Alder emerging from smoke, clutching fragments of truth. He thought of Clara defying intimidation, of Daniel surviving collapse, of Michael navigating wartime intelligence, of Sarah challenging political funding secrecy. America in 2015 was polarized, vibrant, chaotic, innovative, and deeply divided, much like it had been in 1865. Ethan no longer searched for a single secret society. He searched for awareness, for public literacy in how power operates, for resilience in democratic institutions. He released the full Whitfield Alder archive online, open to scholars and citizens alike. Transparency, he believed, was the antidote to shadow. The enduring lesson. The Phoenix Circle may have begun as a desperate post-war conspiracy. It may have dissolved, fragmented, or transformed beyond recognition, but its core idea, that concentrated wealth can quietly steer the course of a republic, proved neither uniquely Southern nor 19th century. It was a recurring temptation embedded in every era. From Reconstruction to the Gilded Age, from the Great Depression to the Cold War, from civil rights battles to digital globalization, the tension persisted between democratic accountability and elite consolidation. The leather satchel burned, the cipher scattered, the names changed, yet each generation faced the same choice Thomas Alder once confronted: ignore the patterns or risk everything to illuminate them. History remembers presidents, wars, and legislation, but beneath those headlines move quieter figures, printers, journalists, analysts, who refuse to let secrets calcify into destiny. On that cold April night in 1865, a train burned in the darkness, a satchel vanished. Powerful men believed their design would remain invisible. They underestimated memory. They underestimated ink, and they underestimated the stubborn endurance of a republic willing again and again to confront the shadows within its own story.